word out about the event. And then we're also just going to let Ms. Clemencia introduce our speaker for tonight. So thank you all for being here.
Okay, thank you so much. So Shona Barnes is our speaker today. She is a mental health manager for Grant Halliburton Foundation, a Dallas-based nonprofit focused on youth mental health awareness and suicide prevention. She's also a graduate student at Southern Methodist University, working on her Master of Science in Counseling. Her background in child psychiatry research has given her a passion for mental health education and advocacy, and she is motivated by the desire for adolescents, parents, teachers, and community members to have the knowledge and resources to recognize and support those struggling with mental illness.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am really happy to be here. Angie, I'm gonna turn the the lobby room to you. Can you still see everybody? Okay.
Yes,
Awesome.
I'll do that.
Okay, and I did hit record. Does that let everyone know that? Okay. Um, all right. Well, let me share my screen and then um okay. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Um, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I will not be able to see the chat while I'm kind of presenting, but I do want to answer questions. And so if you want to write them down or if you want to send them in the chat, I'll come back to that towards the end. Or if somebody kind of wants to interrupt me because there's a lot of questions about one of the slides, I'm more than happy to stop and talk. I just can't manage the chat and use my brain and all of those things at the same time. My name again, thank you for the introduction, is Shauna Barnes. I'm the mental health manager at Grant Halliburton Foundation. We are a nonprofit. We're based in Dallas, but we go all over North Texas talking to um, parents, students, teachers, school staff, community organization, all kinds of people about youth mental health. And so our curriculum is called The Building Blocks of Mental Health because we know that mental health is more than just, do you have a mental illness or not? You know, are you stressed or not? There's a lot of different factors that play into it. And so we want to highlight some of those. But today, what we're going to specifically be talking about is managing stress and anxiety. Our little building blocks of mental health. So I like to start out talking about what is stress, right? And if anybody has an answer that they want to shout out, you're more than welcome to do that. But how would you define stress? Nobody? Okay. So one of the things that we know is that stress is normal, right? I think that we could all, everybody on this call could take a minute and write down the list of things that they're stressed about. And it would probably end up being a pretty long list. We know to expect stress. We know that there is never going to be a long period of time that we are not stressed. So we feel stressed as adults, as parents. Our kids feel stressed as teenagers, but even the elementary age kids feel stressed about schoolwork and different things like that. And so stress is a normal response. And so we like to define it as physical, emotional, or psychological strain. So anything that kind of gives us that strain physically with our emotions, or I think what we tend to talk about stress is that psychological strain. And it's important to know that, but it's also important to know that like stress is normal, it's also our body trying to help us out. So when we talk about stress with our young people, they may not be able to define stress, and that's pretty normal because it's kind of a difficult thing to define. A great way to get them to talk about it is to ask them what it feels like in their body to experience stress, because then we tend to start saying things like, I have my chest feels tight. I get a pit in my stomach. I get a headache, or it feels like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. So it's easier for all of us really to talk about stress in this more physical representation way than sort of to be able to define the different types of strain that we experience. And so stress is a really important, actually, like physical and neurobiological response that our body has. And so there's two different types of stress that we'll kind of touch on. But when we kind of think biologically, the one that we know is also sometimes we call it good stress, but it's acute stress. So acute stress is when we have a stressor or a stressful situation. Um, we can think about when we might be in a dangerous situation, right? Maybe we are, coming off a curb and there's a car that's coming around the corner. So the stressful situation is the car that's coming around the corner, right? And our brain registers our stressor and then it activates our stress response, right? And so this is our amygdala's job. Our amygdala's job is to look out for threats or dangers and to have us respond without taking the time to really think it through. So we would jump back, right? We would maybe gasp, like we would be able to react in a fraction of a second in order to stay safe, right? And so the stress response, that cortisol, that adrenaline, that amygdala response is what then triggers the action of the acute stress response. So this is how it's kind of built biologically. This is our brain's way of protecting us, of keeping us safe from a lot of different situations. Kids might experience acute stress whenever there is something coming up that they are a little bit nervous about. So it could be a big test, a paper that they need to write. It could be a big game or a big performance if they are in theater, or they play an instrument or, other creative art. So something that they have to do that they're worried about. So we have that stressor and we get stressed. We get that stressed feeling inside, right? And so hopefully what that does is propel us into action. We're going to study, we're going to practice, we're going to condition, we're going to do something to prepare for that event. The event will come and we will perform poorly or not, it doesn't really matter, but we'll be able to kind of relax and move on with our life, right? So acute stress has to do with like a particular situation that is a little bit more easily defined time-wise and activity-wise that we're able to do some sort of action to address. So like with the car example, right? The car comes around, my brain sees it and registers it. I jump back out of the way in the nick of time, and then my body's able to relax. I'd be like, whew, I might still have that adrenaline pumping, but I would be able to recognize that the threat had passed, right? And so then my body's like, oh, we're going to go back to functioning like normal. Because when our amygdala triggers our stress response, not everything works the same way because we want to focus oxygen and blood flow to our muscles, to our brain, to whatever it is that we need to do to survive a stressful situation. Our body will actually shut down some of the ancillary systems like digestion, like immune response. And so when the action part is important because it completes the stress cycle. So then that cycle is completed and our brain knows, okay, I can go back. I can, stop pushing this adrenaline and this cortisol. I can shut down now the stress response. The acute stress response, like I said, takes a fraction of a second. Like I think it's about half the time it takes you to blink is how quickly it can be activated, but it takes about 10 minutes for it to respond. So if you've ever had like a near, a close call kind of situation, and you were able to then, it might take you a few minutes once you realize, oh, there's no danger for you to calm down. So this is just kind of the ways that our brain and our body work together in order for us to address stress, and it serves a really important function of keeping us safe and out of danger. Now, when we talk to kids, I mostly talk to middle schoolers and high schoolers, so this kind of comes from them. But when we talk about what actually stresses them out, the number one thing we hear is school demands, right? We know that there's a lot of academic pressure on kids, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The second thing is juggling all the responsibilities that they have, right? If they're in extracurricular activities, if they have a job, if they have chores, if they have responsibilities, and even just within, managing their social situations and their social demands, figuring out how to manage their time and their energy in an appropriate way. So these are just some of the stressors that we talk to them about: big life changes, the future. We know that there is a big shift in peer and romantic relationships during adolescence. We know that they all use technology and social media. We know there have been natural disasters. They've lived through a pandemic. The situation at home, if it is unsafe, if there are, kind of chronic problems at home, that can be a big stressor. Bullying, abuse or neglect, chronic illness, death of a loved one. And then like figuring out who they are, right? What's my identity? Who do I want to be when I grow up? And a lot of kids care about social justice or activism causes that they, feel like are on this bigger meta level, that they are really concerned about things that are going on in the world because they have a lot of access to that and they have opinions about it. So normally we kind of list and we'll shout out some of the things that kids are stressed about. And then I'll ask, well, how many have just one stressor? And pretty much nobody raises their hand. Most kids can identify 5, 6, 7, 10 stressors that they're experiencing at any given time. These stressors also are not quite similar to our acute stress because they're not they're not easily definable in time or situation, right? So social media is not a stressor that we can address one time and then not have to think about, right? We can't leave that in the past. We can't think about school demands in that way either because we have one test and then the next day we're like, oh, we got a paper now in this other class. So they're kind of constant. So they're occurring multiple stressors at a time and they are occurring chronically. They're not easily stressed. Oops. Okay. So we call it chronic stress versus acute stress. So chronic stress is when you have a paper due in one class, you have a big game, your coach is kind of on you to get some extra conditioning in, your parents want you to clean your room, you also want to hang out with your friends, but you're not sure when that's going to work. Maybe you think somebody's mad at you, you also have some more work that you need to do for this other class, and you're just stressed, right? So these stressors pile up, and if we're not careful, um, we end up with a big old ball of stress. So when we talk about stress in America, what we typically are referring to is this chronic stress, these things that keep coming that we continue having to deal with. And oftentimes it's multiple stressors at once. So this is what the other one, acute stress, we sometimes call it helpful stress. Chronic stress, we sometimes call it harmful. I don't know that that's always the best language to use, but that's kind of some of the ways you'll hear that being referred to. Um, so a few things are happening in our brain, and I know that this slide is a little bit overwhelming, so I'm going to explain it. So Dan Siegel is a researcher and psychologist who talks about, he studies the brain in kids and adolescents. And I'm going to share some resources at the very end of some books and just some great things from some experts. But one of the things that he talks about is our upstairs brain and our downstairs brain. So our downstairs brain is going to be like our brainstem and our cerebellum, and they control a lot of like motor function to our body. And then our limbic system is kind of here in the middle. So in the very middle is kind of our amygdala. He has a hand model of the brain. So this would be the brainstem. This is the amygdala and the limbic system. And then the overall cortex is our thinking brain. So this is our upstairs brain. So our downstairs brain is primarily concerned with our bodily functions, with survival, staying alert to danger. And then this is where we see that fight, flight, or freeze stress response, right? Typically the emotion. Yes.
Volume not working.
Oh. So typically the emotions that we might see are fear and anger in the downstairs brain. Now, as we grow, as our brain develops and matures, we get better at this cortical upstairs brain thinking, right? So this has to do with decision making, long-term planning, empathy, right and wrong, self-control. We tend to think of the upstairs brain as being able to respond, whereas the downstairs brain tends to react. And so whenever we reach really stressed out times in our lives, the two parts of our brains, the upstairs and the downstairs, can no longer kind of talk to each other. So if you kind of think about a toddler tantrum, there's something that they're trying to communicate, but when they reach a point that of the tantrum, the upstairs brain kind of goes offline. So we see this sometimes in even adults, right? When we get super overwhelmed, our upstairs brain, our thinking brain, can go offline, and we're just working with that downstairs reactive brain. Now, that is just kind of a little bit of background for how we might view the stress response in kids. So we hear about fight, flight, or freeze, and those are, when we think about the actual words, we understand what that might mean. However, I love this infographic because this is how we experience that in our kids as parents. And so there's like an array here where it's like fight, right? That might actually be actual fighting, like a physical fight, irritable, angry, offended, being aggressive. But it can also just mean kind of being non-compliant or oppositional. It can be blaming, deflecting responsibility, being really defensive. And so we're able to see some of these behaviors look familiar in my house. I don't know about your house, but we're able to see some of the things that we tend to think of as just poor behavior and recognize that this is actually a stress response in kids. So saying like, I don't know, like when you ask them a bunch of questions, fidgeting, restlessness. One of my favorites is being busy with everything but the thing they're supposed to be doing, right? Being preoccupied. And so kids can kind of experience or express this in a way that parents aren't always interpreting correctly. So I think this is a really great slide to just sort of talk about that concept. So when we're kind of offline, when we're having this chronic stress, one of the things that was missing from that was any sort of action, right? And so we know that there's different ways to deal with stress, and some of the ways are harmful. Some of them are not so helpful, and some of them are helpful. So with harmful stress relievers, these are going to be things that might temporarily reduce stress, but they don't long-term solve any of our problems. And in fact, usually the harmful stress relievers cause more problems as we go along. So these are pretty clear. Substance abuse and self-injury, pretty clear how that's harmful. Isolation is different than needing some time alone. Isolation is continuing to be isolated from all the different groups, right? Sometimes they may need a break from a certain friend. Sometimes they may need a break at home to go be by themselves. That's normal. This is more extreme than that when I'm talking about isolation in this way. Anger or rage, again, those are anger is an appropriate emotion that we will all experience because we're human beings, and anger is a part of that. What I mean here in harmful is when we take that anger or rage and we turn it inwardly to kind of tear ourselves down, or we turn it outwardly to tear others down. So that's kind of one of the things we want to look for as harmful. And then avoidance is very similar to isolation. If there's something we really can't face and we just continue to be in this cycle of avoidance, that often causes bigger problems. And then of course, anytime we are bullying, taking out our difficult emotions on other people, that's a concern. This yellow kind of not so helpful zone are things that we all tend to do from time to time. So we all need distraction sometimes. You might have a hard day and you might get on your phone and you might scroll, you might turn on the TV, you may just kind of do something to disconnect. Bottling it up is also something we all tend to do. We can't always have all of our feelings at any given moment, right? Sometimes we are in the middle of math class or we are having a meeting with our boss and we can't fully express our emotions. And so we have to wait for a time that it's more appropriate to do so. Also overthinking, just, that could be great when it's productive, but we can get stuck in a rumination cycle that ends up really adding to our stress. The same with like rigidity and control. When we get really rigid about some of our habits, when we get really rigid about some of our like our eating habits, right? Maybe we get really rigid about that, or we feel like we need to really exert control over certain areas of our life. That can help us feel a little bit better, but not so much in the long term. So this yellow zone of not so helpful, if all of your coping skills are in this yellow zone, that's a problem. If you do these things, or if your teen does these things, or your child, sometimes that's normal. I hope that's clear. So we just don't want these to be the only ways that we deal with stress in this not so helpful zone. And then helpful is, really, these are our healthy, positive coping skills, right? So taking time to relax our bodies, to take a break from whatever we're working on or thinking about, doing some self-reflection, having someone that you can talk about with about your feelings with is really important. And we want our kids too to have a peer that they can kind of be authentic with and talk about feelings, because there's ways that peers are going to understand that child to parent is going to look a little different. Anytime we can laugh or cry, we're physically expressing our emotions is good for us. It's good for our brain. One of the best things we can do is exercise, is moving our body, because that is how our brain knows we're dealing with the stress. If you think about the example of the acute stress where a car's coming and we jump out of the way, right? We had a physical reaction tied to the stress that our brain was perceiving. And even though, stress at work or, being really worried about a test doesn't have that physical component, when we move our bodies, it lets our brain know that we're trying to deal with the stresses that we've kind of accumulated through that chronic stress. So exercise and connection with others are two of the best things we can do for our mental health and our mental well-being. So what would be ideal is, because we know we can't escape from chronic stress, right? We're not going to solve stress and never feel stressed. We're not going to solve some of these problems for the long term, is being really intentional about adding in these positive coping skills, right? We want to be able to add these actions in when we can, so that we're working on reducing the stress because we know that it's chronic. I hope that makes sense. Unlike acute stress, we can't always just fully address the stress at any given moment, especially because we're dealing with multiple things at a time. So the ideal is to be really intentional about building these mental wellness habits in, right? So this is kind of part of those building blocks of mental health as well. We want to just be adding these in for our overall well-being and to deal with our stress. Now, stress, like I said, it is normal. It's part of our body's response, and it also is how we build resilience. So our kids tend to deal with smaller stressors that then they kind of can build on over time. And so even if we don't handle a stressor the best way possible, we are always continuing to build our repertoire of coping tools. Okay. So once we have these coping tools, we think about it as like learning how to tie your shoes, right? That seems like such a monumental task when you're a certain age. And so you practice and you don't do it very good and they come untied, and you continue to practice, right? Until you're able to do this without thinking about it. And so just like that, as we deal with stress, we learn different coping tools that work for us. We learn how, we feel better. We learn what to do. We learn how to handle problems. And so as we learn that, we then have competence. We feel confident that we know what to do in a lot of different situations. We feel competent that we can solve a problem as it comes up. And this is what leads to self-confidence. So sometimes we kind of get this a little bit backwards. We think if we solve our kids' problems, if we help them figure out these stressors, they'll feel good about themselves, right? But it's really in the struggle that we build that competence, because we can't just hand them competency. They have to work for it. And so in this struggle is how we kind of build this positive self-image, this self-confidence, because they realize they can do hard things and they can do hard things in the future. I will have skills that, are appropriate to build upon. So this is kind of how resilience comes about. When we're thinking about parenting, when we think about school, especially, kids build upon these skills. And it's actually really important. So this graph is really confusing if you don't know what you're looking for. So I'm going to explain it. But this was a study that was done about having adversity in your life. So So the yellow arch is life satisfaction, okay? The ones that go down and then back up are negative things like distress, um, functionally being impaired, or having post-traumatic stress symptoms. So what this study found is that people, and then the kind of the bottom axis is how much adversity has this person been exposed to in their life. So what we found that is that people who have either low levels or really high levels of adversity tend to have more negative symptoms like distress and impairment. But there's a really big sweet spot of having some adversity, having some things that you're supposed to work through. So when we as parents try to kind of save our kids from some of these stressors, and we try to fix things and figure it out and use our adult brains to do it, we're actually taking away this resilience that we know is important for long-term life satisfaction. And so this was a really important study that was done. So it's good for our kids to have some adversity. Obviously, things like trauma, really significant situations, are not ideal, and kids need help in dealing with those. So I'm not saying let your kids do everything by themselves, but just understand that this really is a positive thing for their mental well-being. So that kind of wraps up the stress part a little bit. We're going to touch back on some of those concepts as we talk about anxiety, but I wanted to talk about we sometimes use the word anxiety when we're talking about stress, and that's fine. For the sake of this conversation tonight, I want to use anxiety as the word to reference kind of clinical anxiety, something that could be an anxiety diagnosis or an anxiety disorder, because I want to be able to differentiate between the two. So we know that anxiety is the #1 mental health concern of teenagers and adolescents. We tend to see a pretty big increase in the experience of anxiety and the diagnosis of anxiety about 14, 15. That has to do with a lot of life expectations that come that way. You know, school gets a little bit harder, but we also know that that has to do with where they are brain development wise. And so it's really common to see more anxiety about 15 and up. And then most people who have an anxiety disorder or similarly like a depressive disorder in their adult life, most of them had that in their youth. So it's really common to see this in kids. And so I would imagine that's why you're all here, is because this is really common for us to understand. And because we know our kids are experiencing it. So coming back to kind of my little resilience graph, we know that coping tools and competence and self-confidence are important. We know that dealing with stressors and building resilience over time is important. But there is kind of this upper limit of it, right? When somebody experiences either too much chronic stress, more than they can handle, they feel overloaded by the stress, something that's traumatic or something that lasts for a really long time, then what we start to see is dysregulation. We start to see the stress response, and we start to see things like anxiety disorders, right? Diagnosable kind of anxiety. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But I just wanted you to see that there is kind of this upper limit to how much stress we can handle, especially by ourselves. So this is a study, a more recent study that was just done last year, and they kind of looked at a few different contributing factors to youth anxiety. And so what they found is biological factors. So this could be genetic components, right? We know things like anxiety and depression tend to sort of run in families. There tends to be a genetic component. They're often treated with similar things like SSRIs. So maybe it has to do with serotonin levels or dopamine or different neurochemicals in the brain. So that can be kind of biological. It could also be just the situation that they're born into, the life that they're born into if there's particular hardships. Social media and devices, right? We know that this stresses kids out in a way that we're not even fully understanding yet. Family dynamics. So whenever there is tension in the home, whenever there are really dysregulated adults, that can add to it. Academic pressures, just, we expect a lot out of our kids, and, college admissions is really stressful, and just there's a lot of academic pressure along with those extracurriculars. Kids are just involved in so many things, and it's amazing, and we want them to have that experience, but also sometimes that does add to the stress. And then political and environmental uncertainty. So this is that kind of meta level, like national or international situations that kids are hearing about. They're being talked about by their friends. They're seeing it on social media. They're seeing it in the news, and not knowing quite how to make sense of all of that. So these aren't necessarily causes. These were just kind of the themes that these researchers were able to identify, specifically in youth with anxiety. This kind of reinforces that a little bit. This was something that I did with a different district, and we had some of their kind of peer leaders from all of their high schools come together, and I was able to ask them what their top 3 stressors are. So they each got 3 answers, and you can see here that academics was a huge, huge stressor by a mile. So having that academic pressure, these were some kind of high achieving kids, so it's possible that that could look different for different levels of kids, or different kids that have different strengths, and kind of they may have different things that are their top stressor. But we also saw families and relationships, college and financial aid, sports and extracurriculars, the expectations of other people, the adults in their lives, and even the expectations of themselves. So this is obviously just one district. This was one group of kids that I got to talk with, but I think that it kind of highlights some of the things that that research was finding as well. So how do we know when someone is not just experiencing stress, but is experiencing actual anxiety? And so these are the symptoms for generalized anxiety disorder from the DSM-5. So one of the things that we're going to look for is excessive anxiety or worry, right? We all tend to be stressed about something coming up, but if it's excessive, if it feels a lot bigger than the problem, then that's a concern. Difficulty controlling the worry. So even if we recognize that we have an outsized reaction to a situation, we still can't control it. We still can't calm down. We still can't rein it in. And then, like when we talked about stress, there's all of these physical symptoms that show us how stressed we are, right? So fatigue, restlessness, irritability, sleep problems or sleep changes, concentration problems, and then that muscle tension, right? Feeling really tense, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Typically, we want to look for 3 or more physical symptoms of anxiety. And then lastly, all of this together is causing them distress. It is causing impairment in their day-to-day functioning. So these things are making it difficult to turn in their assignments, to, get all the things done that they need to get done. But also they're not sleeping. They're not, maybe functioning the same way even at home. So we want to kind of be able to look for these things. If you look at this list, most of us feel a lot of these things a lot of the time. We live in a high chronic stress society. And so these are really, really common. And especially in teenagers, we know that we're going to see irritability. We know that their sleep's kind of different, right? We know that they're going to experience some of these things. So it can be really difficult to figure out when something has crossed into that zone of anxiety, right? Capital A anxiety. We also know that anxiety can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to just be maybe what we think of as stereotypical anxiety. Sometimes that's called generalized anxiety disorder. People can experience panic attacks. They can have panic disorder. Maybe they just have anxiety around a specific thing. So it could be social anxiety. It could be a phobia, maybe separation anxiety. And then, we also know that we don't have to have a full-blown diagnostic type of anxiety in order to get help. So in younger children, they may not be able to verbalize some of these same things, that these symptoms that we're looking for. So here's just some of the things that you might see in younger kids. We're going to see some of that. Some behavior changes, right? Anytime we notice a really significant shift in somebody's normal behavior, that's kind of a sign for parents to notice. So this could be moodiness, aggression, throwing more temper tantrums than normal, clinging, crying. oftentimes express stress in those physical symptoms like we talked about. So stomach aches, headaches, just kind of constant worrying, constantly kind of having these negative thoughts or fears. With sleep, with teens, we typically think about sleep disturbance, but with kids, we might have sleep problems, sleep disturbance as well, but sometimes that will also be coupled with things like nightmares. So that's something to look for. School refusal is oftentimes a sign of anxiety in children because they're not able to verbalize. They just say, I don't want to go to school, or I don't want to go to XYZ. And then if they start to withdraw from family or friends, that's concerning, and we want to pay attention to that. So this is just kind of a way for us to remember how to figure out when it's different. So when is it normal behavior? When is it normal teen behavior? When is it normal kid behavior versus maybe something bigger is going on? And so this is always going to be about the duration, intensity, and frequency of the behavior. So duration is how long are these feelings lasting, right? Do they have a test on Tuesday, so they're kind of stressed Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, right? That would be an appropriate amount of time to be worried about something. If they have a test Tuesday and they're worried about it 2 weeks before and they continue to be worried about it afterwards, that's concerning. Intensity is how strong we're feeling these things, right? Is this kind of on par with what we would expect? Is this on par with how we've responded to stressors in our past? Or does this feel much more intense? And then frequency is how often are we feeling like this? Is everything a big stressor? Are we feeling stressed all the time? Are we having these anxiety symptoms all the time? So that's just something helpful to remember when we're looking at our kids' normal behavior and we notice that there's a change, but we're not sure exactly what that means. So again, it's duration, intensity, and frequency. It's not all bad. So we know that there's a lot of things that we can do as parents or caregivers that can act as protective factors against anxiety. So one of them is reliable support and discipline from caregivers. What that means is that knowing that we're there to offer them support and also being really clear with our expectations and the guidelines that we expect kids to work within. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail here in the next section. So we want to encourage kids to follow the rules. There is something about having appropriate limits that are that help kids know how to function within those boundaries, and it establishes a good mental well-being level for them. Practicing emotional self-regulation. This is obviously tricky. This is a journey, right? We don't expect our kids to have full control over their emotions when they're young. Several adults still need to work on their emotional self-regulation practices, right? We're all going to make mistakes. But just practicing that, talking about that, modeling that as a parent is really important. Anytime we can improve or add to healthy coping skills, problem solving abilities, and really with problem solving and how it relates to stress and anxiety is that we want to teach kids how to take a big problem and then break it down into smaller, more manageable situations, right? Having a sense of self-sufficiency that goes back to that self-confidence that can kind of only be earned, not given. Optimism, positive self-regard, and super important is the ability to ask for help. We know that we want to let our kids face adversity, face challenges, and work through them because that's how they get these skills. However, we know as parents that they're not ready to take on full-blown adult big world problems. So we have to be available for when they do ask for help. We want them to know that it's not only okay, it's wonderful if we need to ask for help. So making sure that we have that open communication. So what do we do with all of this information, right? Some of this may be new to you. Some of this you may know, but you're like, what do I do with this information? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. One of the first things when we're experiencing anxiety is to kind of focus on what is setting our foundation. Our brain and our body functioning are so tied together, they're so connected that it's really important to focus on our body and on a really basic level, right? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I drinking water? Am I eating food that is giving me vitamins and minerals and nutrients? Am I moving my body in any kind of way that is enjoyable? And am I inside all the time in fluorescent lights, or can I go outside and just be in nature for a little bit? Um, this seems super simple, and so it almost feels ridiculous to remind you as part of this kind of what to do about anxiety. But when we get really stressed out, these are sometimes the first things to go, right? We're not sleeping, we're staying up late because we're working on something or studying or doing, something. We're just kind of eating whatever random thing we can grab, and it's maybe not giving our body the nutrients that it needs. We put off things like taking a walk or going to the gym because we just don't have time. So it seems silly, but these things really are an important foundation for building upon our mental wellness. So adults can help by prioritizing your own mental health. One of the things we hear from kids is that they know that their parents are stressed. And they want y'all to focus on your mental health so that you can then help them with their mental health. It's like the airplane mask, right? Be intentional about stress management, like we talked about, and that's an important thing for the adults to model and the adults to encourage amongst the kids. Recognize those signs and symptoms of anxiety so we can kind of know when we need a little bit more help. Um, when it comes to that upstairs downstairs brain, in order to get the upstairs brain back online, talking with the downstairs brain, we first have to regulate. So if you're having a hard conversation with your child and you become dysregulated, it's important for you to regulate yourself first. Calm down, take a break, do whatever you can to not be in your fight, flight, or freeze mode. Um, and then help your child co-regulate as well. So help them to calm down because we can't do any real conversation work. We can't learn new skills. We can't listen empathetically when we're dysregulated, when our upstairs brain is offline. And then we have to give ourselves grace. None of us are going to do this right the first time. None of us are going to do this right every time. We are all going to make mistakes. We are all going to make reactive decisions or responses that aren't, we know it's not the best thing that we could have said or done in that situation. So understand that all of this is a process, and modeling the grace for ourselves is also important for our kids too. And then we want to check our mindset, which takes us kind of into the next little section. This is from a book called 10 to 25. It's a book about motivating and encouraging young people and how scientifically we know that they can listen to us. So it's by David Yeager. It'll be at the end as well. So he identified 4 mindsets that have to do with what kind of standards do we expect from kids, and then what kind of support do we offer them. So if we have low standards and low support, he calls that apathetic. That's probably the least common type of parent. Um, Most of the people that are, on this call or watching this video because they want to help their kids are probably not in that regards. So what we tend to see on the extremes is the enforcer and the protector. So the enforcer, wants really high standards, and we know to expect things out of kids because it's going to challenge them and it's going to push them and they're going to become better for it. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but then they don't offer a lot of support. So there's low support there. The protector is flip-flopped. We're like, oh, we don't want to give the kids too much things that are hard. Their life's already hard enough. I'm just going to do what I can for them. So we lower the standards of expectations, but we offer high support. So ideally, right, we want to be in this mentor mindset category where we have high expectations of our kids. We want them to push themselves. We want them to learn, to try new things, to get better. But we're also there to help offer high support because we know it's going to be hard. So some of the things that that Dr. Yeager identifies as being motivating for kids is that they really, really value status and respect. And he calls his book 10 to 25 because really that's the time of adolescence. We might hear adolescence and think of teenagers, but sometimes 10-year-olds, right, are actually technically in that category. So they want status from their peers and their adults. They want to see that they're valued, and they want to receive respect from all those people in their lives, right? And so this is what motivates them. Uh, I point this out because a lot of times what motivates our kids, our teens, is not what we would be motivated by as an adult. So Dr. Yeager calls this the adolescent predicament, right? They want status and respect. They want to be treated like an adult, but they're not an adult. And so there's this power imbalance between them and their parents, their teachers, the other kind of authority figures in their lives, who often well-intentionally give them criticism, blame, and shame, and then what Dr. Yeager calls as grown-splaining, right? So when we explain to them why certain things are the way, why they should have made this decision, why you need to do this, you need to call your teacher and you need to handle it this way, they then interpret that as not having status and respect. And so they're more likely to shut down and to not listen to problem solving with us as their adult kind of guidance. And so what the mentor mindset can help us do is to view young people as developing emotionally and cognitively, that they are getting new capacities every day for managing their experiences and their standards. We can consider them capable and worthy of status and respect. So if we can communicate that to them, they are much more likely to work collaboratively with us than if we are signaling that they're not worthy of status and respect. So we want to set high standards, but we also want to have that high level of support and encouragement, while honoring them as their whole individual person. And so when they mess up, when failure occurs, right, when expectations are not met, we don't want to shame or blame. We want to see that as an opportunity for growth and learning, right? So this can help our kids when they're dealing with their stressors, figuring out what they can carry, what they can figure out, versus the things that they need our input on, or they need to come to us for help. And we don't want to just solve the problem like that for them. We want to work with them. We want to treat them as being capable and worthy of status and respect. And so ideally, when we're problem solving things like these stressors that we experience chronically, when we are talking about the anxiety that we might feel, we want to be able to collaboratively problem solve these things with our child, with our teen or adolescent. And this tends to give better outcomes if we're both on board versus us saying, figure it out on your own or do it the way that I say to do it. And so just a few tips on how to offer status and respect. Stay humble and get curious. So ask, don't tell, especially if they're coming to you with a problem. You can say something like, tell me what you've tried so far, right? That lets them know that they've done something to address this problem, and you get to sort of hear how that's gone. Clarify values and beliefs, assume the best about your child, check for your own insecurities. Is this something that's triggering for me? I really cared about grades when I was in school, and I needed to have all the best grades all the time. And I have a child who does not value that the same way that I do. And I sometimes have to be like, am I overreacting because of how it might reflect on me and my values? Or is this really about my child? And so we got to kind of test ourselves for some of those things. Anytime we're problem solving or dealing with a difficult situation, it is best to connect with our child and then move to the problem solving. And then we want to validate and explain. We can have really clear boundaries about what behavior, grades, activities are acceptable in our family or not. This doesn't mean, right, that we don't have rules that really matter to our family, but we just want to be clear about those. And we want to be clear about the fact that sometimes our kids aren't going to like it. You really wish that, you could go to this party on Saturday. Our family rule is that we don't, XYZ, but you're really upset about that. right? That's validation while holding that boundary. And anytime we can, offer choice, give agency to our teens and our young people in solving their problems and dealing with stress and anxiety. If you think that you need a little bit of extra help, there's a lot of ways to find professional help. So you can talk to your regular doctor during a physical or a checkup. You can, if you have insurance, you can call your insurance provider. You can, kind of ask around for different psychologists, therapists, counselor, or psychiatrists, or you can call Here for Texas. So this is another thing we do at Grant Halliburton Foundation. We have herefortexas.com, which is a searchable website where you can put in what you might be looking for in a mental health provider, where you live, all the kind of parameters that might be important to you, and it will give you a list of resources. If even that feels overwhelming and you really don't know where to start, then you can call 972-525-8181 and talk to our navigation line. So this is not for crisis situations, but this is a resource to help families get connected to mental health professionals and mental health resources that they might need. So the line is open Monday through Friday, 10 to 6. It is not a crisis line, but it is available in both English and Spanish. The same goes for our website, English and Spanish. So you can always call us to help figure out kind of next steps. And and I have it on here 2 times. So if you want to take a picture of it on a bigger slide, here is our Here for Texas again. And going back to those symptoms of anxiety, you don't have to have a full-blown diagnosis to seek help. Anytime that anybody just wants a little bit of extra professional help, that is always okay. So, I know that was a lot of information. I hope that what you can kind of take away is that stress is normal and we're all going to experience it. We know that chronic stress is also very normal in our life, but it can build up and become unmanageable. So we need to be intentional about those positive stress relievers. We can identify when we've kind of crossed into anxiety disorders, or we can at least identify when we're maybe wondering if we've crossed into those anxiety disorders. And then parents and caregivers can use a mentor mindset to connect and motivate with our youth, and that we can help. We can help when the stress gets too big. We can help when anxiety gets too big. And maybe part of that help is seeking professional help and guidance, and that's great too. So I am going to stop sharing. Oh, wait, I need to show you the so you can go to our website, granthalliburton.org, or you can email me directly, shauna@granthalliburton.org. But what I wanted to show you was these recommendations. So some of the books that I talked about are on here. So Brainstorm is by Dr. Dan Siegel. It's about the teenage brain and kind of the development that's happening there. The Whole Brain Child is another book he wrote for younger kids and their brain development. You can see here the 10 to 25 Science of Motivating Young People by David Yeager is really great. Both this and Brainstorm give a lot of research and explanation for why the brain of adolescents is functioning the way that it is, but also really practical tips too. So we know that, there's a mental health crisis. The Surgeon General has said that. We now know that there's parents are having a mental health crisis. So, taking care of our own mental health and prioritizing that is super important. And then lastly, these are just 2 really great workbooks for teens. One is about anxiety and one is about self-love. And this is a just sort of local Dallas-based child psychologist who specializes in anxiety. And so she made these books, and I just think they're really helpful, and you can kids can work through them on their own or with somebody, with a family member, etc. So I know that was a lot of information.